What's the most deranged thing your father made you do? My father strapped heart rate monitors to our wrists when I was 13 and forced me to keep my heartbeat within 5 beats of his every second of every day. Dad was a cardiologist who believed synchronized heartbeats created family bonds. He'd read about mothers and babies matching rhythms during pregnancy and decided this should continue forever. When he brought home the monitors, he said other families drifted apart because their hearts literally beat out of sync. The monitors had colored lights, green for matched, yellow for drifting, red for mismatch. The first week seemed like a health experiment, but soon Dad was documenting every variation in spreadsheets. If my rate spiked during gym, while it stayed steady at the hospital, I'd come home to find him with graphs showing my betrayal. He'd make me do wall sits until we matched again. The monitors beeped constantly. During dinner, he'd order me to calm down if my rate climbed. At night, he'd wake me because my sleeping heart had dropped below his. I tried to lose the monitor accidentally at school, but Dad had installed GPS tracking. When I got home, he'd already ordered 5 backup monitors. As punishment for trying to disconnect, he superglued the new band to my wrist. The skin underneath started getting rashes, but he said that was just my body accepting the connection. The glue took weeks to wear off, and left scars I still have. School became torture because teenage hearts don't cooperate. Talking to girls, taking tests, running in PE all sent my rate soaring. Dad started calling between classes demanding reports. I'd hide in bathroom stalls doing breathing exercises. Teachers thought I had anxiety from constantly checking my pulse. The punishments escalated. Meditation for 5 beat differences, ice baths for 10, his modified ventilator machine for 20. He'd strap me to this old medical equipment and manually control my breathing until we synchronized. My first real escape plan involved my friend Tyler, whose dad was a lawyer. I recorded Dad's rants about synchronization and documented the punishments. Tyler's dad said we had enough for custody changes, but needed more evidence of physical harm. So I started refusing the ice baths. Dad responded by holding me underwater in cold bathtubs until my heart rate dropped from panic. He checked the monitor while keeping me submerged, only letting me breathe when the numbers matched. I tried sabotaging his monitor next, spilling water on it during dinner. He had a waterproof replacement ready and made me wear weights during all activities for a month. 20-pound ankle weights that made my heart work harder just walking. My resting rate climbed so high, I couldn't match his calm pace without medication. So I started stealing his beta blockers, crushing them into my water throughout the day. The pills worked until Dad noticed his supply depleting. He installed a camera in the medicine cabinet and caught me. That night he introduced advanced synchronization training. He'd take stimulants to raise his rate to 150, then I had to match it by sprinting on the treadmill. Then he'd take sedatives to drop to 50, and I'd have to lie in ice water to slow mine. The whiplash between extremes made me constantly dizzy. I passed out at school twice. After the second collapse, the school nurse called an ambulance against Dad's orders. The ER doctor found dangerous arrhythmias, but Dad convinced them it was from energy drinks. He signed me out against medical advice and installed monitors in every room displaying our rates in real time. My bedroom ceiling had the biggest screen, glowing red most nights. He'd stand in my doorway calculating correction hours while I pretended to sleep. I made one last attempt by telling my coach everything. He saw the monitor burns on my wrist and the weight bruises on my ankles. He called child services, but Dad had prepared for this. He showed them years of fabricated medical records claiming I had a heart condition requiring constant monitoring. He painted himself as a devoted father using innovative treatment. They left praising his dedication. The breaking point came during finals week. Stress pushed my rate to 120 while Dad maintained 72. The 48 beat difference sent him into rage. 6 hours on the ventilator trying to force synchronization damaged something. My heart dropped to 35 beats per minute and wouldn't climb. Dad rushed me to his hospital claiming I'd experimented with drugs. But the consulting cardiologist found years of electrical damage from stress and manipulation. He called it induced arrhythmia and ordered extended monitoring. That night, Dad visited with a new plan. Surgical pacemakers for both of us, programmed to maintain identical rhythms forever. He'd already scheduled procedures with a colleague. Mine was set for tomorrow morning. The consent forms were signed. I tried to refuse, but he explained the beauty of permanent synchronization. No more monitors, no more punishments, just perfect unity. He kissed my forehead and checked our rates one last time, still mismatched. After tomorrow, that red light will never bother us again. As he walked out, my heart monitor started alarming. The nurse rushed in to find my rate dropping like in the basement. Dad turned back with practiced concern. His heart's been getting weaker, he told her. That's why we need the surgery immediately. She nodded and increased my IV drip while Dad smiled. I'll see you in the morning, he said. Try to keep your rate up until then. The door closed as my vision blurred, and the monitor's beeping slowed to match my failing rhythm. The ceiling tiles above my bed started spinning, and I grabbed the bed rails to steady myself. My chest felt hollow and wrong, like my heart forgot how to work on its own after years of Dad forcing it to match his. The pacemaker surgery was real, and happening tomorrow morning. Dad planned to cut us both open and wire our hearts together forever, with machines that would force the same rhythm no matter what. My fingers found the call button and pressed it 3 times fast. The nurse who came was the same one from before, so I waited until she checked my IV and left. 10 minutes passed before I pressed the button again. I need someone else, I told the intercom when they answered. Personal questions. A different nurse showed up, younger with tired eyes from the night shift. I made myself sit up even though the room tilted. My father's been hurting me for years and I need the patient advocate right now. The words came out steady even though my hands shook. Her face changed from bored to worried. What kind of hurt? She asked. I showed her my wrist with the monitor scars. Medical stuff. He's a doctor here. She reached for the bedside phone, but footsteps were already coming down the hall. Dad walked in wearing his white coat like armor. Everything okay? He asked the nurse with his doctor voice, the one that made everyone trust him. Your son seems confused, she said carefully. Dad nodded like he expected this. He experimented with some substances at the school and we're still dealing with the effects. His voice stayed calm and professional. Classic paranoid ideation from stimulant withdrawal. The nurse's eyes moved between us and I saw her starting to believe him. I'm not on drugs, I said. Test me right now. Dad smiled sadly. Of course you'd say that. The denial phase is textbook. He turned to the nurse. I've been documenting this for months. Poor kid's been stealing my prescription medications. My damaged heart started skipping beats. Get me a different cardiologist, I told the nurse. Someone who doesn't work with him. She hesitated and Dad stepped closer to my bed. That's not necessary. Dr. Shaw already reviewed everything, but the nurse surprised me by nodding. I'll page someone from the South Wing, she said, and left before Dad could argue. The second we were alone, Dad checked his watch. You have 12 hours until surgery. Stop this nonsense. He walked out and I grabbed the tablet from my bedside table. My hands shook, but I got the camera app open and took pictures of everything. The monitor scars looked worse under the harsh hospital lights, raised and pink where the superglue had torn skin. The ankle bruises from the weights had turned purple and yellow. I photographed them all and emailed the pictures to Tyler's account before Dad could come back and delete them. My wallet was in the plastic bag with my clothes, and I found the business card Tyler's dad had given me months ago. The nurse let me use the phone at her station while she pretended to do paperwork. This is an emergency, I said to to his voicemail. I'm at Memorial Hospital, and my dad scheduled surgery for tomorrow morning that I don't want. I gave my room number and hung up as Dad came around the corner. He told the nurse I needed rest before the procedure. Something mild to help him sleep, he suggested. Just 5 milligrams of midazolam. The nurse looked at me, and I shook my head hard. I don't consent to any sedation unless I'm actually dying, I said loud enough for other staff to hear. Write that in my chart. Dad's jaw tightened, but he kept his doctor face on. He's anxious, he explained. Very normal before surgery. The nurse typed something into her computer, and I hoped she was documenting my refusal. Dad stayed in my room after that, sitting in the visitor chair and watching me. Neither of us talked. Around midnight, he finally left to check on other patients. I stayed awake counting the ceiling tiles and checking the clock every few minutes. At 2:30, I heard voices in the hall. At 2:40, someone knocked. At 3 in the morning exactly, doctor. Jillian Turner walked in holding a tablet with my chart pulled up. She was older than Dad, with gray hair pulled back and glasses on a chain around her neck. I'm the independent consultant, she said. Tell me what's happening. Dad wasn't there, so I talked fast, showing her the scars and telling her about the monitors and the synchronization training. She listened without interrupting and typed notes into her tablet. When I finished, she pulled up my cardiac rhythms from the past 3 days. These patterns are unusual, she said, scrolling through the data. The bradycardia episodes don't match typical drug-related arrhythmias. She kept reading, and her frown got deeper. She pulled up more screens on her tablet and started comparing dates and times from different parts of my file. I watched her eyes move back and forth between the data, while my heart monitor kept its slow, unsteady rhythm. After 10 minutes of scrolling, she looked up and asked if I wanted to make my own medical decisions without my father's involvement. I nodded so hard my neck hurt. She opened a drawer in the bedside table and pulled out a stack of forms, flipping through until she found the right ones. The papers were for removing a parent from medical decision-making authority, and I signed them with my hands shaking, so bad I could barely hold the pen. She witnessed my signature and stamped the forms with the official hospital seal before entering them into the computer system. I heard Dad's footsteps in the hall coming back from wherever he'd gone, and Dr. Turner quickly put the forms in her folder. He walked in carrying coffee from the vending machine and immediately noticed the folder in her hands. His eyes narrowed as he asked what paperwork she'd been processing at 3 in the morning. She told him it was standard consent forms for extended cardiac monitoring, which technically wasn't a lie since I'd signed those too. Dad walked over to the computer terminal and logged in with his credentials to check what had been entered in my chart. His face went white when he saw the medical proxy removal forms timestamped 5 minutes ago. He pulled out his phone and started dialing while pacing to the corner of the room. I heard him asking for Frederick Slater, even though it was the middle of the night. Through the phone speaker, I could make out Dad's voice, getting louder as he told Slater about the forms and threatened to pull his annual donations if the hospital proceeded without his consent. He mentioned the new cardiac wing that was halfway built with his funding and said construction would stop tomorrow if they supported this. Dr. Turner ignored his phone call and kept studying my cardiac data on her tablet. She pulled up my heart rhythms from the past 3 days and showed me how the patterns matched what she called stress-induced arrhythmia. The bradycardia episodes weren't random, but followed specific patterns that suggested external manipulation rather than natural heart problems. She typed detailed notes into my official chart, documenting that the irregular rhythms were consistent with prolonged psychological and physical stress. Dad hung up and told her she was making serious accusations without evidence, but she kept typing. I told Dr. Turner I wanted her extended monitoring plan and asked if I could talk to a social worker right away. She picked up the room phone and paged someone named Larissa Shaw, who specialized in family crisis situations. Dad immediately called the OR scheduling desk from his phone, trying to move my surgery up to the next available slot. I heard him telling them it was urgent and asking if there was an opening in the next 2 hours. I told Dr. Turner loud enough for the scheduling nurse to hear through Dad's phone that I wanted an ethics consultation before any procedures. She nodded and started filling out the ethics review request form on her computer. Dad's face got red as the scheduling nurse told him she couldn't book anything without ethics clearance now that it had been requested. I grabbed the hospital tablet from my bedside table while Dad argued on the phone and opened the messaging app. My fingers found Coach McKay's number that I'd memorized months ago. I took pictures of the monitor scars on both wrists, making sure the lighting showed how deep they went. Then I photographed the bruises on my ankles that were still purple and yellow from the weights. I typed a quick message telling him I was at Memorial Hospital and my dad was trying to force surgery on me. His response came in less than 2 minutes, saying he was getting in his car and would be there within the hour. 20 minutes later, Larissa Shaw knocked and entered carrying a folder and a recording device. She introduced herself as the hospital social worker and said she needed to interview me privately per hospital policy. Dad started to protest, but she showed him the policy manual that said initial interviews had to be conducted without family present. He had no choice but to step outside though. I saw him standing right by the door through the little window. Larissa sat down and turned on her recorder, asking me to describe what had been happening at home. I told her everything starting with the heart monitors when I was 13. I described the spreadsheets and the punishments and the ice baths and the ventilator machine. I showed her my wrists and ankles and explained how each injury happened. She took photos with her hospital camera and made notes about the timeline. I told her about stealing the beta blockers and the advanced synchronization training with stimulants and sedatives. She wrote down every detail, including dates and times when I could remember them. After an hour, she stopped the recording and said she needed to speak with the administrator. Frederick Slater showed up 30 minutes later wearing a suit, even though it was 4:30 in the morning. He listened to Larissa's summary and then shook his head, saying that without proof of imminent danger, the law still required parental consent for medical decisions. My stomach dropped as he explained that accusations weren't enough to override parental rights. Dr. Turner had been reviewing my medication logs on her computer while Slater talked and suddenly sat up straight. She'd found patterns in my blood work from the past year, showing irregular levels of sedatives and stimulants that matched exactly with the dates I described Dad's training sessions. She flagged each instance in the system, marking them as evidence of medical abuse. The door opened, and Coach McKay walked in, still wearing his pajama pants under his coat. He told Larissa he'd documented the monitor burns and ankle bruises weeks ago when he'd called child services. He pulled out his phone, showing pictures he'd taken with dates clearly visible. As a mandated reporter, his documentation carried official weight, and Larissa added his evidence to her file. Dad burst through the door 10 minutes later, demanding to know why Coach McKay was there at 5 in the morning, and started telling Frederick Slater that the coach had been angry about a donation dispute with the athletic department for months. Coach McKay reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder with copies of his original reports to child services that were dated 3 weeks before any donation issues even came up. Slater looked at the dates on the reports, and then at Dad, who kept insisting the coach was lying. But the timestamps on the documents were from the hospital's own system when McKay had brought me in after practice that day. I suddenly remembered that Tyler's phone was still in my backpack under the bed, and I asked Larissa if she could grab grab it because I had something important to show her. She pulled out the phone, and I unlocked it with the code Tyler had given me, and found the voice recordings folder where I'd saved all of Dad's rants about synchronization and family unity, and how hearts that beat together stay together forever. The first recording started playing, and Dad's voice filled the room, talking about how the ice baths were necessary to teach proper cardiac control, and how the ventilator training would create permanent bonds between us. Larissa took notes on every single threat and punishment he described, while Dad stood there trying to say the recordings were taken out of context, but you could hear him clearly explaining each punishment and its purpose. Dr. Turner's pager went off, and she said the ethics committee was ready for their emergency meeting about my case, which made Dad's face go white because he knew he couldn't control that many people at once. The committee members filed into a conference room down the hall, and Dr. Turner presented her medical assessment showing that the pacemaker surgery wasn't medically necessary or urgent, and that my heart issues were caused by years of forced synchronization training. Dad tried to interrupt, saying he should be allowed to transfer me to his cardiac service for continuity of care, since he knew my history best, but the committee chair told him that would be a clear conflict of interest, given the abuse allegations. The hospital phone at the nurse's station started ringing, and the clerk answered it, then called out that Roman Corbett was on the line, saying he was an attorney representing me and needed to speak with hospital legal immediately. Dad's jaw dropped when he heard the name, because Roman Corbett was known for taking on medical abuse cases and winning huge settlements against hospitals that enabled abusive doctors. The legal department took the call seriously, and within 20 minutes they placed an official hold on any procedures, including the pacemaker surgery that Dad had scheduled for this morning. Dr. Turner pulled up Dad's home computer files that the police had seized and started matching my bradycardia episodes to the exact dates and times Dad had documented his ventilator training sessions in his spreadsheets. Every single time my heart rate had dropped dangerously low, matched perfectly with a session where Dad had forced me to slow my breathing on the machine until I nearly passed out. The correlation was so clear that even Slater couldn't ignore it, and he started backing away from Dad, who was getting more desperate by the minute. Dad grabbed Slater's arm and said, "My visitors needed to be restricted because too many people would overstimulate my heart condition and make my arrhythmias worse." I recognized this isolation tactic immediately, since it was the same thing he'd done at home whenever anyone got too close to figuring out what was happening. I told everyone in the room that Dad always tried to isolate me when he was losing control, and that I wanted all my visitors to stay and witness everything that was happening. The hospital legal team arrived and announced they were placing a temporary hold on any surgical procedures pending their full investigation into the abuse allegations and conflict of interest concerns. They told Dad's colleague, who was supposed to perform my surgery, that he couldn't proceed, and that any attempt to do so would result in immediate suspension and potential criminal charges. For the first time in my life, I stood up in that hospital bed, with all those people watching, and said clearly that I would not accept any more synchronization training or monitoring bans or forced procedures ever again. My voice didn't shake, even though my hands were trembling as I set these boundaries that I'd never been allowed to have before. Dad reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of medical records, claiming I had a congenital conduction disorder that required immediate intervention to prevent sudden cardiac death. Dr. Turner grabbed the papers and started examining them closely, then pointed out that the computer system showed these records were created yesterday at 11:47 p.m., right after I'd been admitted to the hospital. She showed everyone how the metadata proved Dad had fabricated the entire medical history to justify the surgery he'd already scheduled with his colleague before I even got to the emergency room. The ethics committee members looked at each other and then at Dad, who was still trying to explain why creating false medical records was actually in my best interest, but nobody was listening anymore. Dr. Turner stepped forward and told the ethics committee she needed to run new cardiac tests without any sedation to get an accurate picture of my heart damage. I nodded quickly and said I'd cooperate with everything she wanted to do, since she was the first doctor who actually seemed to believe me. The committee members wrote notes while Dad stood there with his mouth open, like he couldn't believe his fake records hadn't worked. Dr. Turner started ordering EKGs and stress tests and echocardiograms right there in front of everyone while Dad's face got redder and redder. She explained each test would show exactly how my heart had been damaged over the years by forced synchronization training. Frederick Slater cleared his throat and asked Dr. Turner if they could speak privately for a moment about some administrative matters. They stepped into the hallway, but I could see them through the glass door as Slater leaned close and started talking with his hands moving around. His mouth formed words about donations and cardiac wing, and how important Dad's support was to the hospital's expansion plans. Dr. Turner's back got straighter, and she shook her head firmly, then walked back into the room without him. She announced to everyone that her medical decisions wouldn't be influenced by any financial considerations whatsoever. Slater stayed in the hallway looking worried while pulling out his phone to make calls. Roman Corbett arrived carrying a thick folder of legal papers and started filling them out right there at the nurse's station. He told me he was filing emergency paperwork with the court for a protective order and temporary medical decision-making authority. The hearing would happen tomorrow morning at 9, and he'd already gotten it fast-tracked because of the scheduled surgery. Dad tried to look over his shoulder at the paperwork, but Roman moved the papers away and kept writing. Security guards showed up and positioned themselves near the door, while Roman explained the legal process to me. That evening, my heart rate started dropping again, and the monitor began beeping slower and slower. The nurses rushed in and found me barely conscious with my rate down to 38 beats per minute. They started preparing emergency medications, while one nurse said they should sedate me to stabilize my vitals. I managed to grab her arm and tell her I'd only accept sedation if I was actually coding, not just unstable. She looked confused, but Dr. Turner arrived and backed me up, saying sedation wasn't medically necessary for bradycardia. Dad pushed through the nurses and started telling them I had a long history of drug-seeking behavior to get sedatives. He claimed I'd stolen medications from home, and that's why I needed to be sedated against my will, for my own safety. I asked the nurses to run a complete drug panel right then to prove I was clean, except for whatever Dad had given me. They drew blood while Dad kept insisting the tests would show recreational drugs, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. The results came back within an hour, showing only the beta blockers and other cardiac medications Dad had been forcing on me. Meanwhile, Larissa had been going through the evidence we'd collected and found something interesting in Dad's own documentation. She discovered receipts showing Dad had installed cameras in our medicine cabinet at home to monitor my medication access. The receipts had dates and model numbers and installation notes in Dad's handwriting about surveillance equipment. She added these to her growing file, showing the pattern of coercive control Dad had maintained over every aspect of my life. The ethics panel reconvened that evening and made their official recommendation about Dad's access to me while I was hospitalized. They decided Dad could only have supervised contact with specific visiting hours and hospital staff present at all times. Security would enforce this strictly, and Dad couldn't just show up whenever he wanted anymore. Dad argued loudly about his parental rights, but the committee pointed to the fabricated medical records and surveillance evidence. They posted the new rules at the nurses' station, and security got photos of Dad to share with all shifts. The next morning, a young resident showed up in my room carrying a clipboard and acting casual. He started checking my vitals and making small talk about how I was feeling and whether I'd slept well. Then he pulled out consent forms and mentioned how we should probably get these signed before rounds started. I recognized this manipulation immediately since Dad always sent other people to do his dirty work when direct pressure didn't work. The resident kept pushing the papers toward me, saying it was just routine paperwork for my own protection. I told him clearly I wouldn't sign anything or discuss any procedures without Dr. Turner or Larissa present. He tried to act confused and said this was standard protocol, but I kept refusing and asked him who sent him. The resident's face got red, and he mumbled something about just trying to help, then gathered his papers to leave. I grabbed the hospital tablet and documented the entire interaction with times and what he'd said about the consent forms. Larissa arrived an hour later with a box of papers she'd gotten from our house with a court order. She'd found Dad's old spreadsheets from years ago, showing his detailed punishment schedules based on heart rate differences. The papers had columns for baseline rates and deviation amounts, and corresponding punishment hours in different categories. Each page covered a different month with hundreds of entries showing exactly when and how he'd forced synchronization training. She photographed every page and added them to the massive evidence file she was building for tomorrow's court hearing. The next morning, I woke to Dad's voice in the hallway arguing with someone about transfer papers and telling them he'd already contacted St. Mary's where he had privileges, and they were expecting me within the hour. The day nurse came in looking worried and said Dad was trying to sign me out for transfer, but she'd already paged Larissa, who was on her way. Dad pushed past her into my room, carrying a wheelchair, and said we needed to leave now before the morning shift change when more people would notice. I stayed in bed and told him I wasn't going anywhere without my lawyer's approval, which made his face turn red. He grabbed my arm trying to pull me up, but I pressed the call button repeatedly until 2 security guards showed up. Larissa arrived minutes later with her phone already out calling Roman to update him about the transfer attempt. Roman must have worked fast, because within an hour, the nurse got calls from 3 different hospitals saying they couldn't accept any transfer without court clearance due to an ongoing investigation. Dad kept making calls from the hallway, getting louder with each rejection, until Frederick appeared with someone from the hospital legal. The legal team member handed Dad an official document stating that due to safety concerns and the active investigation, I couldn't be discharged or transferred without specific court approval. Dad crumpled the paper and started dialing his phone again, but this time calling reporters and telling them the hospital was violating his parental rights and holding his son hostage. Frederick's face went white, and he immediately called someone from PR, who started monitoring social media for any posts about the situation. Dr. Turner arrived for morning rounds and sat down to explain her treatment plan, which involved starting me on low-dose beta blockers and slowly adjusting them while monitoring my heart's response over several weeks. She said surgery wasn't needed, and my heart could heal with proper medication and time away from the stress that caused the damage. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in days, but kept watching the door expecting Dad to burst in with some new plan. While Dr. Turner was adjusting my IV, I told her about stealing Dad's beta blockers for months just to survive his training sessions and how I'd crush them into water bottles throughout the day. Instead of looking shocked, she just nodded and wrote it down as self-medication in response to sustained medical abuse, which she said showed good survival instincts given the circumstances. Larissa came back with Roman, who had a stack of papers for the emergency child protection petition they were filing that morning. The court had scheduled a hearing for 3 o'clock that afternoon, and Roman explained the judge would ask me questions about my safety and what I wanted to happen next. He said to answer honestly and not worry about how Dad would react since security would be present the whole time. Around noon, Dad showed up with Frederick and 2 other administrators, plus a nurse I'd never seen before. His eyes were red, and his voice cracked as he apologized for pushing me too hard and said he only wanted us to be close because he loved me so much. He talked about how losing my mom when I was young made him scared of losing me too, and the heart monitors were his misguided way of staying connected. Some of the staff started looking sympathetic, but I recognized this performance since he'd done similar acts for child services before. I looked directly at Larissa and said clearly that his apology didn't change my need for safety or my medical decisions about refusing any procedures. She wrote down my exact words while Dad's face went from sad to angry, then back to sad when he remembered the audience. The nurse checking my vitals pulled Dr. Turner aside and showed her the monitor readings from the past day compared to when Dad had unlimited access. My heart rate had stabilized to a normal range, and the irregular patterns were already improving just from having restricted contact and knowing I was protected. Dr. Turner added this to my medical file as objective evidence that Dad's presence directly affected my cardiac function in measurable negative ways. 3 o'clock came faster than I expected, and Roman wheeled me down to the courtroom they had inside the hospital for these kinds of emergencies. The judge was already there with a court reporter and 2 security guards standing by the doors. Dad sat at a table with Frederick and a lawyer I didn't recognize, while Roman helped me to the witness stand. The judge asked me basic questions about my age and understanding of what was happening today. I told her I was 16 and understood we were here about my medical care and safety. She asked if I felt safe with my father making medical decisions for me. I said no, and explained the years of forced heart synchronization and the planned pacemaker surgery. Dad's lawyer tried to object, but the judge let me continue. I described the ice baths and the ventilator machine and showed her the scars on my wrists from the monitors. The judge studied the medical reports Dr. Turner had submitted showing the induced arrhythmia patterns. She read Larissa's documentation of the abuse timeline and Coach McKay's witness statement about the bruises. After 20 minutes of testimony, she called a recess to review everything. When she came back, her face was serious, and she looked directly at Dad. She granted the temporary protective order and appointed Roman as my temporary medical proxy until a full hearing could happen. Dad's face went completely white, and his hands started shaking as he realized he couldn't control me anymore. His lawyer whispered something, but Dad pushed back from the table and stormed out with Frederick following behind. The judge reminded everyone the order was effective immediately, and security would enforce it at the hospital. Roman helped me back to the wheelchair, and we returned to my room where Larissa was waiting with paperwork. An hour later, Dad showed up at the nurse's station demanding to see me and sign discharge papers. He told them he was taking me to another hospital for a second opinion about my treatment. The charge nurse called security, while Dad kept insisting he had parental rights that couldn't be taken away. 2 security guards arrived and explained the court order prohibited him from making any medical decisions for me. Dad started yelling about lawsuits and how he'd donated millions to this hospital over the years. Frederick tried to calm him down, but Dad pushed past him toward my room. Security blocked the doorway and told him he needed to leave the cardiac unit immediately. Dad shouted that they were making a huge mistake and his colleagues would hear about this. He said I was manipulated by people people who didn't understand our family's medical situation. The guard started walking him toward the elevator, while he kept threatening to ruin everyone's careers. I watched through the small window in my door as they led him away. His face was red and twisted with rage as the elevator doors closed on his shouting. For the first time in years, I took a deep breath without worrying about matching anyone else's rhythm. Dr. Turner came in later that afternoon to do the cardiac evaluation she'd planned. She explained she would keep me awake and aware during the whole test, so I'd know exactly what was happening. She attached new monitors that only measured my heart's electrical patterns without comparing them to anyone else's. She had me do light exercises like raising my arms and standing briefly while she watched the readings. I cooperated with everything because I knew she was trying to help me heal instead of control me. The test took about an hour with breaks whenever I felt tired or dizzy. She showed me the results right away on her tablet instead of hiding them like Dad always did. The patterns showed clear electrical stress injury from years of forced synchronization attempts. She pointed to areas where the rhythm was irregular, but said this was my heart trying to find its natural pace again. The good news was I didn't need a pacemaker or any surgery at all. She documented that my heart could heal with proper medication and time away from the synchronization stress. She prescribed a low dose of beta blockers to help stabilize my rhythm while my heart recovered. Larissa came by the next morning with a folder full of discharge planning options. She explained I couldn't go home while the investigation was ongoing, so we needed to find a safe placement. She had contacted several supervised living facilities that worked with teens in crisis situations. She also mentioned that relatives could apply for emergency custody if any were available and appropriate. We went through each option and discussed what my daily life would look like in each setting. I'd need regular medical checkups and therapy appointments wherever I went. She said the court would review the placement in 30 days to make sure it was working. While we were talking, Coach McKay knocked on the door and asked to come in. He said he and his wife had been discussing my situation since the court hearing yesterday. His wife was a pediatric nurse who understood medical trauma, and they had a spare bedroom in their house. He offered to be my temporary guardian if the court would approve it. He already had all his clearances from being a mandated reporter at the school for 20 years. Larissa said this could work since he was already involved in the case and had witnessed the abuse. She started the paperwork right away, while Coach McKay called his wife to prepare the room. The court approved the arrangement that afternoon since it kept me in the same school district. Roman also worked on getting accommodations for my final exams that were coming up next week. He contacted the school and explained the medical situation and ongoing legal proceedings. The principal agreed immediately to let me take my exams in a quiet room with extended time. They also waived the attendance requirements I'd missed during my hospital stay. Roman made sure everything was documented properly so my grades wouldn't suffer from this crisis. Meanwhile, the hospital administration was dealing with the fallout from Dad's behavior. They placed him on administrative leave pending an internal review of his treatment of me. They also required him to undergo a psychiatric evaluation before he could return to work. His colleagues in the cardiology department started distancing themselves as news spread about what he'd done. Some doctors who'd praised his dedication before now understood it had been obsession all along. 2 days after the court hearing, I was finally ready to leave the hospital. Coach McKay arrived with his wife, who introduced herself as Susan, and immediately made me feel comfortable. She had my medications organized in a simple daily container without any complicated monitoring systems. They drove me to their house in a quiet neighborhood about 10 minutes from the school. The spare bedroom had a normal bed and desk with no medical equipment or heart rate displays anywhere. Susan showed me around and explained their basic house rules about curfews and chores. She said she'd check my vitals once a day just to track my recovery, but nothing more. That first night, I lay in bed listening to my own heartbeat without any monitors or alarms. No red lights glowing from the ceiling, and no one standing in the doorway calculating correction hours. My heart beat at its own pace, sometimes fast when I thought about everything that happened, and sometimes slow when I started to relax. Susan knocked gently the next morning to check if I needed anything. She took my pulse the normal way with 2 fingers on my wrist and wrote it down in a small notebook. She said my rate was normal for someone recovering from trauma and medication adjustment. There were no spreadsheets or graphs or punishment calculations, just a simple medical check to make sure I was healing. Coach McKay made breakfast and talked about normal things like the weather and the basketball team's chances this season. Nobody mentioned synchronization or heart rates or family bonds through matching rhythms. The next morning, Dr. Turner called to schedule my first appointment at her office away from the hospital. She wanted to start adjusting my medications now that I wasn't in crisis mode anymore. I took the bus there since Coach McKay had practice and Susan was at work. The office was in a regular medical building with no connection to Dad's hospital network. Dr. Turner checked my vitals and looked at the readings from the past few days. She decreased my beta blocker dose slightly and taught me new breathing exercises that focused on my own comfort. She showed me how to breathe from my diaphragm to calm anxiety without worrying about matching anyone else's pace. The exercises were about finding what felt natural for my body instead of forcing it into someone else's rhythm. She gave me a simple log to track how I felt each day, but said there were no wrong answers. 2 days later, I had my first therapy appointment that the court had ordered as part of my recovery plan. The therapist's office had soft chairs and no medical equipment anywhere in sight. I started by showing her the scars on my wrists from where the monitors had been superglued. She took photos for her records and asked me to describe the synchronization rules Dad had created. I told her about the spreadsheets and graphs and punishment calculations for every heartbeat difference. She listened without interrupting as I explained the ice baths and the ventilator machine and the underwater sessions. When I finished, she looked me straight in the eyes and said, "What Dad did was medical abuse and torture." She used those exact words which nobody had said so clearly before. Hearing someone name it that way made something shift inside me. She said my responses to survive that abuse showed incredible strength and resourcefulness. Roman came by Coach McKay's house that weekend with boxes of evidence we'd collected over the past months. He spread everything out on the dining room table, and we started organizing it chronologically. There were the recordings from Tyler's phone and the photos of my injuries and the medical records Dr. Turner had documented. We had witness statements from Coach McKay and the school nurse, and even some teachers who'd noticed things. Roman created a timeline showing how the abuse escalated from the first monitors to the planned pacemaker surgery. He put each piece of evidence in clear plastic sleeves and labeled them with dates and descriptions. Having everything organized in binders made it feel more manageable and less like chaos in my head. I could see the pattern of abuse laid out clearly instead of just feeling lost in the memories. Finals week came faster than expected with everything else going on. The school had arranged for me to take my exams in a small conference room in the administrative building. There were no clocks on the walls and definitely no heart rate monitors or medical equipment anywhere. The proctor was just a retired teacher who sat quietly reading while I worked through each test. I could actually focus on the questions without constantly checking my pulse or worrying about correction hours. My hand didn't shake when I wrote, and I could think clearly without the fear of punishment for wrong rhythms. I finished each exam without that familiar panic about whether my heart rate was matching someone someone else's. 3 weeks passed with daily medication adjustments and weekly therapy sessions and regular check-ins with Roman about the case. Dr. Turner called me in for another evaluation to see how my heart was responding to the new routine. She ran an EKG and did some other tests that measured heart rate variability throughout the day. She showed me the results on her computer screen and pointed out improvements in the patterns. My heart was starting to find its own natural rhythm now that it wasn't being forced to match someone else's. She said she was cautiously optimistic about my long-term recovery, but warned it would take months or maybe years to fully heal. The electrical damage from years of forced synchronization wouldn't disappear overnight. She adjusted my medications again and scheduled monthly follow-ups to track my progress. The court date for extending the protective order came up, and Roman represented me in front of the judge. Dad's lawyer argued that the initial order was an overreaction, but the judge reviewed all our organized evidence. She extended the no-contact order for a full year while the criminal investigation continued. Roman explained this meant I wouldn't have to testify in criminal court yet, which gave me time to focus on healing. The investigators were still building their case and interviewing witnesses and reviewing medical records. Dad couldn't contact me directly or through other people or come within 500 feet of me. One afternoon, I found Dad's original heart monitor in a box of my things from the hospital. The band had been cut off my wrist during one of the emergency treatments, but someone had saved it. I held the device that had controlled my life for so many years and thought about destroying it. But then I remembered what Roman said about preserving evidence for the investigation. I put it in a plastic bag and gave it to the investigators the next day. They said it would be useful for showing the jury exactly what had been used. That night, I lay in bed at Coach McKay's house, counting my own breaths to fall asleep. There was no red display on the ceiling showing my heart rate and no alarms if it dropped too low. My heart beat at whatever pace it wanted without anyone monitoring or correcting or punishing. Sometimes it sped up when I had bad dreams, and sometimes it slowed when I felt safe. Nobody stood in the doorway calculating how many hours of correction I needed. My heart was finally free to find its own rhythm, after years of being forced to match someone else's beat. Alright, thanks for hanging out with me through all of this today, folks. Kinda wild to share all these thoughts with you, and I really appreciate you sticking around till the end. And if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.